I believe everyone has a story to tell. And I believe everyone deserves a little pampering. Welcome to Mannies with Grannies. I'm your host, Tiffany Marino. Join me while I sit down with a woman over 70 and get to know her while giving her a manicure. Welcome to this episode of Mannies with Grannies. Today, I'm in the home of Margie. I really don't know much about Margie at all. I met her daughter through Facebook, and here we are today. I'm really excited to get to know you. Thank you for having me here today.
You're welcome.
We can take your hands out of here. So I'm unfortunately scared of dogs, and you and your daughter were nice enough to coordinate today for me, so I didn't have to worry about your pups. Tell me about the dogs that you have.
I have Prudy, who is in the bedroom currently, who is going to be 7 years old next week. She's a German Shepherd mix that came from a rescue in Texas. They brought her as far as Erie, and we went and got her there. And Maggie is a little over 2 years old. She was one of the babies of my daughter Jody's dog. So she's a boxer mix with a little pit bull and a little other things in her. I recently had to put my almost 18-year-old miniature poodle down. I miss him a lot.
Oh, that's tough.
Yeah.
Some people are cat people. Some people are dog people. You're a dog person.
I'm a dog person. I used to have a couple cats, but not anymore.
Did you grow up having pets?
I grew up on a farm outside of Youngsville, and we had all kinds of animals. But as far as pets, we had a white Cocker Spaniel. And we had a white cat whose name was Snowball. Queenie was the Cocker Spaniel. And then, of course, we had cows and pigs and chickens.
Did you work on the farm?
Oh, absolutely. There were 9 of us children. We all had our turns at working at various things. When I was little, I couldn't wait to grow up so I could learn how to milk cows. Well, after I learned how, I kind of wished I hadn't. And we always had big gardens, so I had helped my mom can food. And we had our own milk, and we made our own butter and all kinds of stuff.
Did you have a favorite chore on the farm?
It definitely was not cleaning. Working outside in the summers, I picked a lot of berries, wild strawberries and then wild huckleberries, which are much smaller than blueberries. So it took a lot of time to pick a quart of either one. My last year where I really did a lot of berry picking was, I did a lot of it after my senior year, although I was working then in my senior year in high school. But I picked over 100 quarts of berries the one summer. So, yeah.
Did you have a mission in mind? Was there a reason why you picked so many?
When I was younger, we had to pick 2 quarts for my mom, and then we could pick 1 quart to sell. And of course, she always took the ones that were not as cleanly picked as others, and she kept those and then sold the ones that were more cleanly picked. I was the youngest of the 9, so when it got so it was just me, then I could pick 1 for her and 2 to sell. So I made a little money that way.
The youngest of 9 kids.
Mm-hmm. And now there's only 2 of us, my sister Edie and I. She lives in Georgia, so I haven't seen her in a few years.
What was it like growing up with 8 older siblings?
Well, my brother Art worked. He was 14 years older than I was. I can vaguely remember him in high school, and then he went away into the Army right out of high school. So I didn't see too much of him for a few years, but when he came back, he worked at the National Forge Company. He got a job there. My sister Joyce was 12 years older than I was, and she helped my mom a lot with taking care of all of us smaller kids. And then she went to be a nurse, so she went into nurses training and became an RN. My brothers, Dave, Dick, and John, they were just enough older than I was that they didn't really want to have much to do with me. But next oldest to me was my brother Ted, and he and I were pretty close growing up, and he would play games with me and stuff where the older ones just couldn't seem to be bothered. But we played a lot of games at home. That was a Sunday afternoon thing. And, before everybody was watching sports on TV and all that they do nowadays. We played board games and card games. My mother said that I learned to play 500 bid before I started first grade. And I was 5 years old when I started first grade. It was fun growing up with all of us.
Do you remember what it felt like when your brother went away into the war?
Well, there wasn't really a war going on at the time. He just went into the Army. Fortunately, there was not a war. But I remember, I think I was in 6th grade, I think, when I had my appendix out. And he was home on leave, but was going to be going back. And I had my surgery. And then the day that I was supposed to get out of the hospital, my mom had planned a big supper for him because he was leaving again. And I was looking forward to that. And wouldn't you know, my incision opened up and I couldn't go home. I was so upset.
How old are you?
75. I'll be 76 in January.
What year was it that you had your appendix out?
Oh, golly. I don't know what year that was.
What was that like?
Back then, they didn't do any laparoscopic stuff. It was all just open surgery. And then the very bottom part of my incision opened up that day, so I couldn't go home. It was not anything like it is nowadays. It was a lot more troubling back then to have surgeries and things than it is nowadays.
What were your parents like?
My dad was a really hard worker, obviously. He, of course, took care of the farm, along with my brothers helping. But he also worked at the National Forge from 3 to 11. And he was a part-time mail carrier, so he delivered mail in the mornings, worked from 3 to 11, came home and got some sleep, got up, started with doing chores, and then went and delivered mail. So he was a very hard worker. My mom was more of the disciplinarian as far as most of us went. I mean, depending on what the issue was, some things my dad would get in on too. But my mom had trained to be a teacher, and she had taught until she got married. But back then, if a woman got married, then she could no longer teach. So she had to quit.
It was all single women that were teaching.
Mm-hmm. You weren't allowed to be married and teach back then. A lot of things have changed, haven't they?
Yeah, and it's interesting because sometimes you don't even know what has changed.
Right.
You know, something
Right.
like that I wouldn't even think
Yeah,
about.
most people don't realize that. But yeah, she had to quit teaching. Of course, then she had so many of us that she had to be home anyway. As soon as she got married, she had to quit teaching. They just weren't allowed to be an influence back then, I guess, on young kids. Look at things nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
She was a hard worker too, obviously raising all of us, cooking and baking and making butter, and she made homemade bread, and she was a really hard worker.
What qualities do you think you took from your own parents?
I've always pretty much been a hard worker as far as my jobs went. I was a teacher, so I guess I took that after my mom. I would take papers home and grade. A lot of teachers nowadays can't be bothered with that, but if I assigned something, I felt I needed to look at it and grade it. So I was always up late doing my paperwork and figuring out grades when the time came to do the grades and all that. That's one of the things I guess I got from both my mom and dad. They were both such hard workers.
Did you go to college right after high school?
Yes, I went right to Clarion State College. It was still the state college when I went to it. That was in 1965.
Did you have to move out of your family home to go to school?
Oh, yes. I had to move to Clarion and live in a dormitory.
How did that feel?
A little odd at first, I guess, but it didn't take long to get adjusted. I had a very nice roommate, so everything went well. I was in the band in high school, and I continued that down at Clarion. So I was in their band, and the marching band, the concert band, the jazz band. I played trumpet. Music has always been a big part of my life.
Do you still play?
Not anymore, unfortunately. I ended up giving it up, but I don't know why. Sometimes I think I should get my trumpet out. I still have it in the closet. But I know I wouldn't be able to play anything. I used to be pretty good, but anymore I wouldn't be able to. I've lost all my armature.
What's armature?
That's the conditioning of your lips they get, you have to work them and...
Like the muscle memory.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. It's all part of it. My son Josh started to play the trumpet, but he ended up giving it up. Jody was never interested in him. She loves music, but she was never interested in being in the band. And Josh was never interested in being in sports. Neither one of my kids were in sports.
You have the two?
Well, I had one before these two, Justin. I was 36 when I had him, and we lost him the next year when he was 10 months old in the fire at the babysitter's house. So, yes, I lost that one. And that was probably the hardest thing I've ever had to go through in my life. But I survived it, so thanks to my family and my friends and my church family, they all helped me get through that. And the Lord helped, because I said to my sister Joyce, she came home to spend some time with me then. I was on the pill at the time. I said, well, when this month's pills are up, and that was in September, I said, I'm not taking any more. That's it. She said, well, don't plan to get pregnant again right away, because your system is going to be messed up from this trauma. She said, so don't plan on getting pregnant right away. Beginning of November, like November 2nd or something like that, I went and I was pregnant. So the Lord helped.
How did that feel to find out you were pregnant again?
Oh, it was amazing. I was so thankful, because by then I was almost 38. I didn't know if I was going to be able to get pregnant again, and I was just hoping and praying that I could. And then I had Josh at age 40. So the Lord was looking out for me.
It was Justin, Josh, and then Jody?
Nope, Justin, Jody, and then Josh. Which I think was probably the ideal way, because if I'd had the boy right away, I probably would have been doing more comparisons with Justin, where having a girl, that was entirely different.
Can you tell me how you picked their names?
Well, Justin I named because of a book series I had been reading. The main character in the series was named Justin, and I liked that character, so I picked Justin. And coming up with a middle name was harder. I don't really even know why I picked Ryan, but it just seemed to go with Justin Ryan. So named him that. Well, then we decided when we had the other ones that we wanted to stick with J and R. So when we had Jody, it was Jody Ray, and then Joshua Robert. Robert was my brother Ted's middle name, and Don, their dad, it was his brother's name. So we got that included in there. But the other ones were really pretty random.
So Don was your first husband?
He was my second husband. I divorced my first one. He and I quit seeing eye to eye, and he knocked me around a little bit. And I said, enough's enough. So I got out of that one. He was a big drinker. Going back to the hardworking, that reminds me, at one point I had 3 jobs. I was teaching full-time during the day. I was waitressing in the evening, doing flower gardens and things like that for the restaurant I worked at. And then I also had a nighttime teaching job where I taught Spanish at night for adults. So yeah, I had 3 jobs going at once.
Very hard
I look
work.
back on it now, I don't know how I ever did it. I wouldn't be able to think about it now, but it just all fell together.
Did you like waitressing?
I did, yes. And I thought I did a pretty decent job of it. In fact, I ended up going back to it besides teaching. When my husband, Don, had to quit driving truck, he was a truck driver. And when he had to quit because of his health, then we needed a little more income. So I went back to waitressing again. Then just up the road at the Rustic Log Cabin restaurant up here. And then he ended up dying suddenly of a heart attack. So that was rough. Jody was 9th grade and Josh was 7th grade at the time. And then as it turned out, up there at the restaurant while I was waitressing a couple years after Don had died, I ended up meeting my third husband, Rodney, and he owned this place, so that's why I moved out here then. So, things have a weird way of turning out. Never want to give up hope. And then Rodney died. We married in 2001, and then he died in 2007. So I've had my fill.
You've experienced a lot of loss.
I have.
You have a light or happy energy about you.
Well, I try. It doesn't do any good to be sad all the time. It took me a while after I lost the baby in the fire. It took me a while to really get happy again. But, you live and you learn and figure out what you got to do to keep going. And having the kids helped me get through that, too.
Loss and grief are an inevitable part of our lives, the worst part of our lives,
Right.
But something we all have to live with. Do you have any advice for getting through hard times like that?
Well, basically, I relied on the Lord a lot through any of my losses. And my church family, they all really helped. My mom was still alive at the time we lost the baby, and she came out and helped, so she was a big help. she ended up going into the Rouse nursing home, and that's where she died a few years later. She was still alive at the time my husband Don died, and I went in to talk to her. She could never figure out why the Lord took my sister Joyce and not her. My sister Joyce had been a nurse. She moved back to Youngsville, retired and came back to Youngsville, bought a house, and my mom was living with her, and she died very suddenly. So my mom ended up having to go in the nursing home then, but she could never figure out why the Lord took Joyce and not her. Well, then when I had to go in and tell her that Don had died, she said, "Now I know why the Lord left me here. It was to be here for you and the kids."
That's nice. She was able to be there for you.
Yep. I mean, she couldn't come out and help much, but just knowing she was still there. Yeah. But then she died the next February. He died on Labor Day weekend, and then she died the following February. But she could see I was doing okay, so.
Well, you still have a lot of life ahead of you.
I hope.
Do you have anything you're working toward right now?
I bowl a lot. I'm trying to get my average up. I bowl in 2 leagues regularly, on a Monday morning league and a Thursday night league. The Monday morning is a mixed league, and Thursday night is a women's league. And then I sub on the Tuesday night league and the Wednesday morning league. And of course, sometimes we have tournaments that go on. So sometimes I'm bowling 4 or 5 times a week.
That's a lot.
It keeps me going.
Do you have any goals for the rest of your life?
Goals. Just to keep living, I guess. I just want to stay around as long as I can for my kids. Josh lives in Pittsburgh, so I don't see him as often as I used to. But Jody lives like a 10th of a mile down the road from here, so I see her a lot. And she does most of the cooking nowadays, so I go to her house for dinner. Works out good.
Oh, that's nice. Did you teach her how to cook?
No, she didn't want any part of being in the kitchen with me. Now, Josh would help me cook. He'd come out and learn how to do things. But she has finally learned, and she's a pretty good cook now.
Was there anything that was your specialty? Anything you're known for cooking?
Everybody likes my broccoli salad that I make. And deviled eggs. That's what I have to do for tomorrow, is deviled eggs and baked bread. But otherwise, I don't know that I ever had really any specialty dishes.
Would you like to choose a nail color?
Oh.
You have a pretty colored top on. Pretty purple.
I know, but I don't wear this color very often. So, do you have a regular clear? That's probably will work for as well as anything for me.
What were you like as a teenager?
Oh, well, depends on who you ask.
What if I asked your best friend?
I really wasn't a troublemaker, even though my kids don't really want to believe that. I really wasn't a troublemaker. I was in the band and rode on the band buses and all that, but I got good grades. I studied. Now, if you ask my mom, I don't know. Most of the time, she and I got along good, but there were probably a couple years in my teens where, like most teenagers, I was a little more rebellious, but still I didn't do anything really bad, so I think pretty much everybody would say I was a decent teenager. I like to think I was.
Looking back over your life, is there anything maybe you wish that you would have said yes to that you didn't?
No, not that I can really think of.
Anything you wish you did different?
Maybe not married my first husband.
Saying that now is probably easier than thinking it then.
Oh, back then, I was in love. I think I was 23, thought I was old enough to know, but
did you have any inkling that it might not work out?
No, he drank quite a bit, and that should have been a clue, I guess. But sometimes I drank right along with him, not like he did. I didn't get drunk like he did all the time. In fact, when we split up, I told him, I said, when you die, I'm always going to remember you with a beer in your hand. And that's the case. As soon as he got home from work, he'd have a beer in his hand, or he'd stop on his way home.
When you were looking for a new partner, was that something that you took into consideration?
Not really, because I met Don in the bar when I was bartending. I mean, he drank at times more than he should have, but for the most part, he was more of a responsible drinker. I guess I really didn't take it into consideration, no. When your heart calls, I guess it calls. We had 17 years, I think it was, Don and I actually had together, because we dated a couple years before we got married. And then we were married a year and a half, 2 years before we had a baby, so... But I really can't think of anything I regret doing or wish I had done differently. life is what it is, and you just got to learn to roll with the punches. I do have kind of a boyfriend. We lived together for a while, but we no longer live together.
I'm curious what happened there, that you were living together, but you don't anymore. Can we talk about that?
Oh, well, I don't know if I really want to go into the
I
details.
get it if you don't want to.
Well, a lot of it was health related because he got so he would not listen to me and eat and drink and stuff like he should.
And not take care of himself.
Right. So he's living on his own now. He has a worker that comes in and helps him.
You didn't want to sit back and watch him not take care of himself.
Right.
I get that.
Yep. I'm too old for that. He ended up going in a nursing home. I just couldn't bring him back here because I was so afraid that if I did, he would go right back to having me do everything, and he did nothing for himself. And I just don't want that, I didn't want that for me or for him.
I think that's really insightful for you to be able to recognize and then even act on.
My kids were behind it, too. They were behind him not coming back. Oh, forgot to silence my watch.
That's okay.
It's my son calling. Jody said, "Don't tell Josh what we're doing." She said, "Well, I'll just tell him to go listen to the podcast when it comes out."
Oh, that's fun.
So he doesn't know we're doing this at the moment.
Do you have grandkids?
I have stepchildren and step-grandkids also, but 2 stepdaughters from my marriage to Dawn, and they both have children, so I have stepchildren there.
Is there anything else you want to talk about today or tell me about?
Well, I just kind of wanted to mention, we talked about my other losses, but we didn't talk too much about my other siblings that have passed away. My brother Carl died of AIDS. He was the first one of my siblings to die. He was also a nurse, by the way. And then my sister Joyce, who was the nurse, was the second one to pass away. And I thought that was really bizarre that the 2 nurses in the family were the 2 that passed first. I just thought that was weird.
Where in line was Carl?
Carl was after Joyce. It was Art, then Joyce, then Carl. And then my brother Dave, and then my sister Edie, and then brothers John, Dick, and Ted, and then me at the end. And it cracks me up. My mom said she had 1 boy and 1 girl. And then she had 2 boys and 1 girl. And then she had 3 boys and a girl. And she said there was no way I was going for a 4th girl and having all those boys in between. So that always kind of made me chuckle. My oldest brother, Art, was among the later ones to pass away. My brother Ted, next to me, died of leukemia. My brother Dick died of bladder cancer. My brother John died of esophageal cancer. Dave had to have heart replacement. He was on a machine for quite a while, but then the heart became available and they put him, and he survived that for a while. But finally, the anti-rejection drugs were hard on his kidneys, and that's finally what did him in, I think. Just a lot of losses, but you keep going.
Sometimes I like to think about that. Even though we suffer these losses, it's only because we had the love in our lives.
Well, that's true too. You got to look at it that way.
So you had a lot of people loving you and surrounding you with love in your life. Unfortunately, part of it is losing that.
Right.
But I feel like then we can appreciate it differently.
Yeah, I think so. Some of my friends really have a hard time dealing with their losses that they have, and I try to help them, but sometimes they just get buried in their sorrow, and that's not a good thing, and it's hard sometimes to try and get them out of that.
What do you do to try to help your friends in those times?
Just try to go visit, take them out to eat, get them to go to a movie, just get out and do things. I try to get them bowling if they can. Things like that. So, just try to get them active so they don't have so much time to sit and think about it.
That's a good point. Yeah. So your brother Carl passed away from AIDS. Mm-hmm. What year was that?
I honestly don't remember.
Do you remember if it was like in the 90s or more recent?
I'm trying to think. Let's see. I think he died maybe in the 70s.
That must have been scary to hear that diagnosis
no, it wasn't
at that time.
Yeah, maybe 70s, yeah. My mother was very protective of me not knowing for the longest time. He would call her and she'd be crying on the phone to him. Or he would be crying to her and then she'd go into tears and then I'd try to find out why. Well, Carl, he had a partner, and sometimes he would call because they were having their issues, and of course Mom didn't want me, I guess, knowing at my very young age at that time that Carl was gay. But then when he got sick, at first she kept it from me that it was AIDS, but then eventually I found out. And I went with my brother Dave and my sister Edie, I think my brother Art, and I all made a trip up to Boston. He lived in Boston when he was on his deathbed, and we all went to see him. But I knew a little before that that's what he was dying from, was AIDS.
Your brothers, is it Tom, Dick, and John? Is that
Ted, Dick, and John?
Ted, Dick, and John. It sounds like the three of them, were they like the three amigos or the three musketeers? When you mentioned them together.
Well, that's because they were the three right in a row. Actually, it was more Dave, John, and Dick probably, and Ted did more with me. Not a lot, but I mean, for a while. Eventually, we got really buddy-buddy. But I really miss him. He was also a teacher, and he moved to Florida, but he would come up in the summers, and he would stay here, and his friend Linda had also moved to Florida. They were living together, but they would travel together, and she would go up and stay with her family in North Warren, and he would come here and stay, a month, 6 weeks. It was always nice. Well, then he got too sick to do that. I tried to get down there in time to see if I could do a bone marrow transplant, but by the time I was there, he had gotten too sick. They couldn't move him to the hospital that he needed to go to get that done. So it didn't work out. But it's kind of one of the things I worry about. There's so many different cancers in there, but none of the ones like breast cancer or any of that generally deal with women. But leukemia can hit anybody.
With having experienced so much loss and seeing other people's end of life, is that something that you think about for yourself?
Not really. I guess my biggest concern would be if I were to have a stroke or something, but that's how I try to stay active. So hopefully I'm not going to have one of those, but you never know. They can happen to anybody also.
I'm 38, so I'm close to 40. Do you have any advice for me at this point in my life?
Just do your best to stay healthy. Take vitamin supplements if you don't, because I think they're important. Vitamin D3. I staved off, I think, a lot of different things because I take 5,000 IUs of vitamin D3 every day. I think it helps.
I'll take that advice. This was lovely getting to know you and getting to talk to you today.
It's been fun.
Yes.
Making me think.
Thank you for having me here and doing this with me today.
You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to Manny's with Grannies. I hope you enjoyed learning about someone else, and maybe even learned a little about yourself.